So welcome again, and now it's the first lecture of Corporeality, and Luisa and me, we will host it then together. It is now Thomas Fuchs who will talk to us. I already introduced him. He's professor from the University of Heidelberg, so I won't repeat now the whole affiliation, which I worked so hard on, but I would leave immediately the word to Luisa, who will give perhaps a little short introduction about context, and very, very short, so okay.
No, just to say very shortly, it's a pleasure to have Professor Fuchs with us, and that it's very nice to start this series of lectures with somebody who is so busy with this connection between psychiatry and philosophy, and who brings so much our attention to how our awareness of our corporeality also mediates how the awareness we have of our own emotional experience. And yeah, so I give the word to who can talk about it better.
Thank you very much, Isabella and Teresa, for this kind introduction to the, also for the invitation, of course, to this, I think, remarkable conference with its combination of practice and theory, which is quite unique. And we had practice and experience already this morning, and now it's time for a bit of theory. So it's a bit like walking. You use the left leg, right leg, left leg. Okay, now it's the left leg, a bit of theory. Emotion and motion are closely related and connected to each other, as the word already indicates. And emotions may be considered the most complex phenomenon that indicates our embodiment. But this is mirrored by a huge number of different emotion theories, both in philosophy and psychology. And there have been many attempts to say what emotions actually are. I will only mention two of them. The first is the famous theory of William James and Lange, which is kind of a first embodiment theory of emotions. Simply put, the theory says that we do not shiver because we are scared of something, for example, of a lion, but we shiver. And this is what we feel as fear. So in other words, emotions are feelings of bodily changes. This seems a bit counterintuitive, maybe also to you, even to you as embodiment practitioners and theorists. And a theory has been widely criticized for the problem that it neglects the intentional content, so the kind of aboutness of emotions. The fear of the lion. So the lion should be somehow included in the fear and not only in the shivering. And there's another, but rather opposing or contrary theory, which is the current one, but it seems no less one-sided. According to the predominant cognitive approaches, emotion mainly consists in an act of evaluation and appraisal of a given situation. So again, simplified, we believe and judge the lion to be a dangerous object, and then we want to run away as a result of this judgment, and all this is our fear of him. However, these belief-desire concepts of emotions have been notoriously unable to cover their self-affecting, their intense character. What is lost in this account is the affectivity, that I'm somehow affected. It's me that the lion somehow threatens. And we have, without bodily experience, we have no intensity of the emotions. How could we be particularly scared or more intense afraid if that is just something cognitive going on in our heads? Well, you see, the problem of emotions is a difficult one. and we better proceed in a number of steps. And I proceed in the following way. I give a short account of what emotions could be. I give an account of research on the embodiment of emotions, and then I present a model of embodied affectivity, which can also be applied to embodied interaffectivity, to the empathic encounter with the other. And if I have time still, then I can give a short view to the development of interaffectivity in early childhood. Okay, so let's start with the problem, or with the question, what emotions actually are. My first contention, my first affirmation would be that emotions are not somehow in the head or in the mind of someone. They are affective responses to events of concern to us. They always imply a specific bodily reaction, and they motivate a specific expressive behavior. So emotions emerge from experience a whole situation, persons, objects belonging to this situation, which have their expressive and affective qualities. So in a sense, already the situation is affectively loaded. It's not something that I add to it only in my head. Emotions also show us what is relevant, what is valuable, what is attractive or repulsive. So what the affective qualities in our environment are. Now, what is particularly important is the bodily resonance that is connected to emotions. Emotions are experienced through the body in many intensive and manifold ways. This includes all kinds of local or general bodily sensations. So let's say feeling of warmth or coldness, tickling or shivering, pain, tension, relaxation, constriction or expansion, and etc. They also correspond to certain postures that we take on, that express a certain emotion. And they also correspond to certain kinesthetic feelings and movements that are at least induced or suggested by the emotion, such as clenching one's fist or one's jaws with anger, moving backwards or forwards, bending or straightening oneself, etc. All these are expressive gestures. Particularly rich fields of bodily resonance are the face and the gut. For example, sadness may be felt locally as a lump in the throat, a tightening in the chest or in the belly, a tension around the eyes, a tendency to weep. Or it may just be experienced globally as a sagging tendency, a tendency to fall. Or it may be experienced as a painful wave spreading through the whole body. So we can see any emotion is somehow connected to a very subtle and rich field of emotional sensations, action tendencies, and postures. The body is the medium of our emotions, the medium of our emotional relations to the world. It is a resonance body, like the body of a violin, so to speak, and that is also what William James, the famous psychologist, once wrote about the bodily side of affection. The body is a sounding board in which every emotion, however slightly, reverberates. A particular part, as I already said, of this resonance is the action tendency. So emotion means literally to move out. And that is what can be called action readiness. Frieda, a Dutch emotion researcher, termed this action readiness and emphasized the different reactions and directions, such as approach, avoidance, being with someone in enjoyment, for example, attending when we are interested in something, rejecting, for example, in disgust, or antagonistic, dominating, submitting tendencies, such as arrogance or humility. All this is an action tendency. Similarly, de Rivera, another psychologist, distinguished 4 basic movement tendencies which are present in emotions. Moving toward the other, in affection, for example. Moving the other toward oneself, so in desire. Moving the other away from oneself, in disgust and anger. Or finally, moving oneself away from the other, as in fear. So we see emotions imply a certain general tendency that is already intersubjectively directed. Now, what I want to present now are some results of embodiment research that have been gathered in the last 1 or 2 decades and that show quite clearly that this bodily resonance is something that can be really demonstrated. The bodily resonance of emotion. One of the first embodiment researchers is actually Charles Schulz with his wonderful Charlie Brown description of what is the depressed stance. So this is my depressed stance. When you're depressed, it makes a lot of difference how you stand. The worst thing you can do is straighten up and hold your head high, because then you would start to feel better. So if you're going to get any joy out of being depressed, you have rather got to stand like this. Okay, that is in a nutshell the result of present embodiment research. So without any testing laboratory experiments, but these have been done in the meantime, and they show similar results. If you take a slumped, so a bowed position versus an upright position, you will have more negative memories that are induced when you ask test subjects for their memories of the last 2 weeks. So the attitude and the posture already influences what you remind. If you make a person contract, you make a person take a pencil between her teeth, and thus she somehow mimics a smile. And if you give the same person a pencil between her lips so that she cannot smile, then there's a significant difference in the cartoons that you show to this person. In this condition, the cartoons are judged much funnier than in that condition, where you cannot laugh. So the laugh, or the smiling, supports or induces a certain emotional evaluation of the cartoons. Similarly, if you let people do an approach movement, so drawing something towards them, then they find quite strange Chinese ideographs much more interesting and positive than if you make this person push something away. So the avoidance motion, pushing something away, induces less interest and something like a rejection of something which is normally just neutral, because you have no idea what Chinese ideographs are about. But it changes something. Then a quite interesting result. If you give a person a hot cup of coffee in the hand, and you show him different portraits of persons that he has never seen, then he will find these persons much more sympathetic, so warm in a sense, than if you give the person a cold cup of coffee or an iced cup of coffee in the hand. So warmness or warmth, interpersonal warmth, is something that you feel with your body. And if you feel warmer in a certain atmosphere, in a welcoming surrounding, then it's not only because you feel emotionally, but you also feel bodily warmer. So that is interchangeable in a sense. A nice example, finally, is the example of the frowning muscles that may be paralyzed by Botox injection. You know that this is done for aesthetical reasons, and after Botox you are not able to frown like before. And you see this frowning is immediately a somehow critical expression. If you frown, you think something is not like it should be, something wrong. Something wrong outside, something wrong in you, and so on, or within you, and so on. So what happens if you investigate these persons after Botox injection, you find that they have an impaired understanding of negative sentences. So negative sentences that cause frowning are somehow take longer to be judged, to be evaluated in their negative content. And even more, you can do this, you can take this as a kind of therapy for depression. The self-criticism in depression is reduced, and Wolmer and colleagues have found that after 6 weeks of Botox injection, the depression of test subjects diminished significantly, just because they cannot all the time indulge in self-criticism. Self-criticism, so reproaches against oneself, are always connected with this frowning. And if you suppress this frowning, if it's no longer possible, then the persons actually have less self-criticism than before. All this shows the results of embodiment research, and in some, you could say, when individuals adopt emotion-specific postures or make emotional gestures bodily, then they also tend to experience the associated emotions, and it also tacitly influences their emotional preferences, their attitudes towards a situation, towards objects or persons. And you can do this the other way around, as in the case of Botox, when individuals' expressive movements are somehow inhibited, then the associated emotions may be less experienced or not experienced at all. Particular problem for Parkinson's patients, because in Parkinson you are not able to smile really, so you kind of judge things less interesting, less funny. All joy is somehow drawn out from your life because your face is so stiff, and you cannot experience the joy really. So this leads me to a model of embodied affectivity. Emotions may be regarded as bodily responses, but not only, of course, bodily responses, but they are directed towards something, namely the values, the affective qualities of a given situation. So emotions somehow combine, or they integrate my bodily attitudes and sensations with a given situations that I perceive. So they are overarching, encompassing phenomena. For example, the shame here in an embarrassing situation, and the dismissive gazes or pointing fingers of others are experienced as a painful bodily affection. Shame, a redness of the face, a thrill or heat in the body, and that is the way the subject feels the shaming situation, the sudden devaluation in others' eyes. So the emotion of shame is extended over the feeling body and the situation as a whole. That is shame. Emotions may further be said to imply two components of bodily resonance. There is a centripetal component, so directed towards us. So that is the way we are affected by something, moved or touched by something. For example, the blushing or the burning of shame, that's the way we are affected in shame. But there's also a movement tendency, a centrifugal or emotive component that is directed outside, so to speak, a specific tendency of movement. For example, in shame, it would be what the person does here, hiding his gaze, hiding his face, trying to sink into the floor from shame, trying to vanish somehow. So we see there's an emotive component in shame as well. And all in all, emotions may be said to be something where we are moved, we are affected to move towards something or against or away, as I said before. And this leads to what I call a cycle of embodied affectivity. Emotions may be regarded as a circular interaction between affection and emotion. So between how we are affected by something, by the affective qualities and values of a given situation, and how we react to this situation through our bodily resonance. And this resonance already contains a certain action tendency, even if we do not indulge to this tendency, even if we do not act it out, it's still somehow present. Okay, once again, the example of shame. These are the affective qualities of the embarrassing situations. The person is affected by his bodily resonance, and his emotional tendency is to hide his face, to somehow avoid the situation, to fly, to sink into the floor, or whatever. So that would be a model of embodied affectivity that includes both poles, the bodily pole and the pole of the present situation. Modification of bodily resonance, as we have seen, leads to changed affective perception. So if we enhance the resonance, through, for example, through alcohol, that will lead to an enhanced resonance towards funny or gay situations. We can also enhance resonance through mindfulness, through techniques which help us being aware of our bodily sensations and of our bodily reactions. But there's also a lack of bodily resonance, which leads to a reduced affective intensity. We had already the example of the Botox reducing resonance, but there's also a body defense, which many persons, for example, obsessive-compulsive persons show. They show a kind of rigid stance, a rigid tension in their bodies, because they do not want to indulge to affects, in particular to aggressive affects. They want to have a straight posture, to keep away from uncontrolled affects, and that is what makes them so stiff in their body. That's an habitual bodily defense, and it reduces certain affects that they do not want to have. Another example of a changed bodily resonance is the lack of bodily resonance or affectability in depression. Depression may be regarded as a constriction or freezing of the body, which leads to a general emotional numbing. Finally, even to an affective alienation. The patients in severe depression cannot feel their emotions any longer because the body is so rigid that they can no longer be moved by the situation. Even they can no longer be moved by their children, for example. They know rationally that their children are there to them, but they cannot feel the emotional affection, and that is very tormenting, that is very painful for the patients. They lose their interaffectivity, their interaffective relation to others. Solomon, in his book, The Noonday Demon, autobiographical account of depression, describes it as a loss of feeling, a numbness, which had infected all my human relations. I didn't care about love, about my work, about family, about friends. So that is the emotional numbing, which may be regarded as a lack of bodily resonance and affectability. So far, a short account of embodied affectivity and a model of it. Now, we have seen already that this is closely related to interaffectivity, to the relations to others. Emotions imply action tendencies, but they also imply social tendencies. They are essentially relational. And this leads to a model of embodied interaffectivity. So our body is always affected not only by some situations, but specifically by interpersonal situations, by the other's expression. and we experience the other's emotion through our own bodily resonance, through our own bodily kinesthesia and sensation. So that means that in every social encounter, one could say that two cycles of embodied and affectivity are united, are interlaced, are connected to each other. So this is a complex phenomenon and a complex process which I want to describe in short in a model. Yeah, that repeats what I said. In every social encounter, two cycles of embodied affectivity become intertwined. And one could describe it like this. Let us assume there are two persons. A is a person whose emotion, for example, anger, manifests itself in typical bodily changes, facial, gestural, interoceptive changes, which may be called the bodily resonance of the emotion. So he feels the anger as a tension in his face, as a sharpness in his voice, as the arousal in his body, and so on. This resonance is also an expression of his emotion, of his anger. That means his anger becomes visible and becomes felt and perceived as such by A's partner, B. The expression will produce an impression in B, namely by triggering complementary bodily feelings. So, for example, A's sinister gaze, the sharpness of his voice, perhaps his expansive bodily movements, might induce in B a kind of unpleasant tension or even a jerk or a tendency to withdraw. We also can remind the situation of shame, where the presence of others induces an embarrassed aversion. Sadness may induce a tendency to connect to others, and so on. This is the bodily resonance of the other's expression. Now, B not only sees the emotion in A's face and gesture, but also senses it with his own body, through his own bodily resonance. However, it doesn't stay like this, for the impression and bodily resonance caused in B now, in turn, becomes again an expression for A. It will immediately affect A's bodily reaction, change his own expression, however slightly. For example, he might increase his anger or might decrease his expression of anger because he suddenly realized, oh, I've been too expansive here. So the bodily expression of B again induces an impression in A, thus in modifying his own bodily state. And this creates a circular interplay between impressions and expressions that runs in split seconds and constantly modifies each partner's bodily state. So in that sense, they have become parts of a dynamic interaffective system that connects both bodies in interbodily resonance, as one might say. Of course, the signals and reactions are far too quick, too fast to become conscious as such. Instead, both partners will experience a specific feeling of being connected with the other in a way that may be termed mutual incorporation. They have become sort of part of an extended bodily field. They feel the other with their own body, as if the other somehow became a part of their body, even if it's an unpleasant part, but as in anger, but somehow they form a connected field that may be called mutual incorporation or extended body. So each felt body reaches out, as it were, to be extended by the other. And in both partners, their own bodily resonance mediates and enables the emotional perception of the other. That is what the French phenomenologist Merleau-Ponty, as a first philosopher and phenomenologist, called intercorporeality, intercorporeity. And I quote from his famous book, The Phenomenology of Perception, "The communication or comprehension of gestures comes about through the reciprocity of my intentions and the gestures of others, of my gestures and the intentions that are discernible in the conduct of other people. It is as if the other person's intentions inhabited my body and my intentions inhabited his." So that is also an indication of this mutual incorporation that takes place in embodied emotional interaction or intercorporeality. If you are aware of the current accounts of social cognition and empathy, you might know, or you will know, that they usually proceed quite differently from that. They assume a kind of internal modeling of the other, which is usually called theory of mind or mind reading. I have to somehow infer what is going on in the other person, because the other person is kind of a black box to which I have no access. And that's why in social cognition, in academic psychology, concepts of theory of mind are usually dominant and prevalent. To give an example, let's say we have two footballers, so two teammates of a football team, and one of them has made a goal, and he raises his arms in joy and excitement and about the goal that he has made. Now, in this current theory, this means that I have to somehow take this view inside my own brain, where it creates an inner model of the other, and this is connected with a perception of the other, an internal image of the other, and this is again connected with a theory of mind module, a theory of mind mechanism, which tells me, oh yeah, this person must be happy. Because he does this and that, and this lets me infer that makes me assume that this person is happy. Well, obviously, that is a very complicated and academic and rather cognitivist account. The phenomenological and embodied account is very different from that, as I've already indicated, because it would rely on the embodied social encounter, on the interactive cycle between one person who is a whole body and not just a brain, and another person who is an expressive body and not just a mind inside a body. And this creates an interactive cycle, an interbodily resonance between two persons, where impression and perceiving are related to acting and expression, as I said before. So this person would perceive the other immediately as happy, and also as someone whom he could share his happiness with, so a person who is ready to hug, so to speak, and this could equally and immediately lead to to this expression of the shared joy, so to an interaffective and intercorporeal encounter that doesn't need a theory of mind or an internal modeling of the other, because it is just the result and the expression of a shared interbodily resonance. So that would be the difference to current mainstream accounts of social cognition and empathy. Of course, we must be aware that this interbodily resonance process is not at all a process which always leads to harmony and just harmonious empathy. It can also lead to quite intense and fierce engagement, even to a resonance catastrophe, as here in the following case of a couple fighting or discussing, debating with each other. So here we have also a kind of interbodily resonance, but in this case it's a kind of negative feedback cycle or vicious cycle of resonance, which leads immediately more and more into a fierce battle between the interactants, between the agents, but it is still something where we do not need a theory, it's the immediate embodily encounter. Okay. Empathy, as we have seen, is based on bodily interaction, feeling the other with one's own body, feeling how the other feels by the impression that his expressions create in my own body, and vice versa. We can also support this concept by current results of dynamical system accounts of what goes on between two persons. This is not a phenomenological or subjective account, but it is an account based on observation of what goes on between a couple of agents. And we find that there is also a coordination of movements and expressions that can be visible for an observer, that can also be measured. There's an old observation already by Condon and Oxton that two interactants in a conversation somehow synchronize and share the movements. They kind of tune into a coordinated sensory motor coupling. There's a synchronization, as I said. There are imitation tendencies going on, and this creates what I had already said, a resonance. But not only a felt resonance, but also something that can be observed, that can even be measured. And results, more recent results from such research show that, for example, walking together is more synchronized in dyads with a positive relationship. So if you observe couples walking together, or two persons walking together, you find that in this case, nice synchronization is more significant when there's also a positive relation between two agents. So this is just an observation without asking the persons how they feel in this walking together. It's just the observation of the shared coordination of the shared rhythm between them. Interestingly, this also pertains, and this also shows in psychotherapy sessions, as shown here. In psychotherapy, interactive synchrony is correlated with empathic understanding and quality of the relationship. That's a bit older study here, but this has been shown also more recently in results from the so-called motion energy analysis. That is just a statistical method to count in an embodied encounter, therapist and patient, to count the quantity of movements that both partners make or show, and the computer program just measures the quantity of the movements, whether they are synchronized or not. And in this way, without any subjective experience, they just measure the motion energy during a therapy session. And this also creates interesting results. In the study of Ramsayer and Chaha with 70 psychotherapy patients, synchrony in this sense, now this is not synchronous, but in other ways, in other situations, it is more synchronous or in phase, so to speak. Synchrony was significantly correlated with therapeutic alliance, with attachment, and therapy outcome. So we see that coordination is something, and synchronization is something that is not only felt internally, but that can also be shown in observation or in measuring, and that tells us something about what is internally going on between patient and therapist. Now, I'm a bit in lack of time now. Do we have 5 minutes still? Or pardon? Yeah. Just to show quite shortly, it's soon finished, that this phenomenon of interaffectivity has a history. It starts with its coordination and synchrony already in newborns. Here's a nice example of how newborns imitate the tongue protrusion or mouth opening, lip protrusion or frowning of adults immediately, even some weeks after birth. So there's an imitation going on very early on. And emotions in this stage primarily emerge from the dyadic interaction of infant and caregiver. There is a proto-conversation long before language by smiling, vocalizing, gesturing, turn-taking patterns between mother and baby. Babies are already able to recognize the basic emotions in mothers and fathers after 2 or 3 months. There are temporal flow patterns and kinematics which lead to an emotional understanding. A particularly nice way to put it is in Italian melody, in Italian words that describe the musical dynamics: crescendo, decrescendo, accelerando, ritardando, sforzato, mosso, dolce. All this can be expressed in movements, voices, and postures between mother and child, and creates an emotional language, an interbodily language. Daniel Stern, the developmental psychologist, has called it vitality affects, but the name doesn't matter. It's something where the emotional language between mother and child already works before any symbolic language later on. This creates affective attunement, dyadic affective states between infant and mother, and it also leads to a pre-reflective knowing of how to interact with others, a kind of experience that already a child at 2 or 3 or 4 months has acquired of how it is to be with others, how it is to be nursed by the mother, how it is to play with daddy, and so on. So all this creates an intercorporal memory of how it feels to interact with others. You could say it's also a kind of musical memory because it contains the tune and the melody of the usual and the familiar interaction with other people. So in the end, we might say that this story, this short picture that I've shown here, a tendency to hug, to share joy, may be derived from an implicit relational knowing, from an implicit interactive knowledge that is acquired in early childhood. You see the quite similar attitudes, ways of hugging, ways of putting one's face on the shoulder of the other. And of course, this is somehow related to the brain in which such procedural memories are sedimented. But that doesn't matter here. It's just to say that intercorporeality has a history that dates back to early childhood. And the conclusion is, I've shown models of embodied affectivity and interaffectivity, mainly based on the polarity between being affected by something and being induced to move somehow towards an emotion towards the other. So in every face-to-face encounter, each partner's lived body reaches out towards the other. They both form an overarching and encompassing system through interbodily resonance and mutual incorporation. Developmental research also indicates that this emotional understanding and empathy are based on an intercorporal memory of how to interact with others that dates back to early childhood. And thus we see that from the start, emotions are not inner states in our head that we somehow have to bring out or that we somehow have to infer in others, but emotions are encompassing shared states that we experience through interbodily resonance in the shared situation. Or in short, in emotions, we are moved to move and moved to move together. Thank you very much for your attention. This is a book on embodiment in action and culture in which many of these considerations are also elaborated in more detail. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was really a great lecture. You put really a very complex subject, very comprehensive speech.
It's a complex subject.
Very many
thank you for the talk. I'm interested to know whether you think that this embodiment account and the cognitive account, such as the theory of mind, should be two different things. Because I think it's also a long-term controversy in this field. Because, for example, in order to understand more complex condition or to have some kind of sympathy, sometimes you need to know more about certain condition in order to have this kind of sympathy. So in that condition, do you think that some cognitive understanding or this reasoning process is also necessary? And also, another way is if you don't have certain kind of body experience, such as people born without a hand or something, they probably cannot have this simulation or motor resonance in a sense. But according to some literature, they also have the same kind of emotion. They can also understand what other people mean or how others feel. So it seems to be that there should be some compromise between these two different groups.
Yeah. Okay,
so
I see what you mean. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. That is a very legitimate question, and I immediately can say, yes, it's true. We have the additional and kind of later on acquired possibility to also make sense of what others do and what others are, of what their intentions are, by kind of knowing more about them, asking what they are up to, knowing their background, knowing their situation, and being able to transpose ourselves into their situation to make sense of what they are doing or what they are wishing. But that is an additional higher level account of social cognition. These capacities are usually acquired in the 4th and 5th year of life, and they help us to additionally enrich our empathy, no question, but they are based on this first level account of embodied interaction. And one support for my claim is, for example, autism. Autistic children lack precisely the emotional understanding on this embodied level. They cannot make sense of expressions of others. It's just like the others would be strange objects that behave in a certain way that makes no sense to them. They cannot resonate with the other, and therefore the emotional understanding is severely compromised, and also the whole intersubjective social development is severely compromised. What high-functioning autistic people learn is to develop a kind of theory of how others function. If they make this, it means, oh yeah, this person feels joyful somehow or wants to show sympathy. That is exactly a theory of mind, because they do not feel what is really going on. They have to acquire a kind of additional knowledge which lets them make sense of the situation, precisely because they lack the primary emotional level of interaffectivity. So yes, you are right. There is an additional cognitive level, and they are not contradictory to each other, but we have to stay aware that the primary embodied encounter is the basis for all higher forms of intersubjectivity. I think you just try and...
Yes.
Yeah, it works.
Yes. Ich würde gerne auf Deutsch fragen, also danke für den Vortrag. Und mir scheint, dass ein Konzept auch hinter dieser Intercorporeality ein Konzept der Einfühlung steht. Und ich wollte noch mal fragen, was ganz genau derjenige, der sich einfühlt, das wäre jetzt Person B, was diese Person eigentlich fühlt. Fühlt sie ihre frühkindlichen Erinnerungen oder fühlt sie ihre eigenen momentan Affekte oder fühlt sie den anderen? Also weil das ist der schwierigste Fall, das dritte, das zu beschreiben.
Ja, völlig richtig. Das überlappt sich tatsächlich ein bisschen. Lassen wir mal die Erfahrungsvorgeschichte weg. Sonst genügt ja schon zu sagen, dass ich in einer emotionalen Begegnung mit einem anderen sowohl meine eigenen Gefühle und die Gesamtsituation irgendwie spüre, die Chemie, die da abläuft zwischen uns, die Atmosphäre, die da entsteht, aber auch die Gefühle des anderen wahrnehme und spüre. Und offensichtlich gibt es Möglichkeiten, beides wahrzunehmen, sogar auch ein bisschen überlappend und ineinander geschoben. Aber ich kann sowohl die Stimmung und Atmosphäre fühlen und empfinden, die zwischen uns entsteht. Ich kann aber auch durch das wache Aufmerksamsein die emotionalen Reaktionen des anderen mitspüren und miterleben. Und beides ist sozusagen in dieser Resonanz enthalten. Manchmal kann man es nicht so genau auseinanderhalten und es ist dann auch eine Frage der Erfahrung, ob man seine eigenen Gefühle sozusagen ein bisschen projiziert hat auf den anderen oder ob man wirklich empathisch nachempfinden und fühlen kann, was der andere denkt oder meint. Das ist tatsächlich nicht ganz leicht auseinanderzuhalten. Sie haben also recht, beides ist in dieser zwischenleiblichen Situation mit enthalten.
Also nur ganz kurz, ich habe ja nur die Übersetzung des Körpers des anderen, ich habe ja nicht die Gefühle des anderen.
Ja, aber die Gefühle sind nicht im Inneren, die Gefühle sind Emotionen, es sind Ausdrucksformen. Es ist nicht so, dass der Körper des anderen die Gefühle nur anzeigt, so wie ein Wort, das wir lesen, irgendwie ein Gehalt anzeigt, sondern die Gefühle sind schon sichtbar wie im Ausdruck des anderen, wenn auch nur zum Teil. Man kann ja auch den Ausdruck verstellen oder hemmen, dann ist das Gefühl ja auch noch nicht weg. Es ist nur nicht mehr sichtbar geworden, es ist nicht ausgedrückt.
Okay.
Ja? Okay.
Okay. Yeah, also thank you for the talk. I have a question in regard to the concept of intercorporeality. If you think you could also apply this notion, especially the interaffectivity between bodies and spaces. If you could apply it, and if yes, if it's
certainly
possible to see it in that, to use it for that.
As I said, this notion of, or this idea of embodied affectivity is not only related to other persons, but also to situations. Why not to just spatial situations? Sorry, it takes some time to get back to that. To spatial situations such as, leave that aside. You have the situation with its affective qualities. Let's say you walk into a Gothic cathedral. There's no other person present, but you will immediately sense the affective quality of the huge surrounding, of the kind of somber atmosphere that envelops you. And when you go into this cathedral, you might feel something like a bodily widening, or maybe a certain tension, because you feel the kind of respect or the awe of the cathedral touching you, affecting you. So, of course, this emotional cycle can be directed to situations with affective qualities that do not have any interpersonal others being present. It's just the atmosphere, an architecture, let's say, or the atmosphere of a serene Mediterranean countryside or whatever. Is that what you wanted to ask? Yeah. Okay, so this may be directed to impersonal situations as well. Okay. Ja, ich weiß. Wir haben noch 10 Minuten, gell? Ja, geht schon noch. Ja. Yeah, but I didn't say that is interaffective. The notion of interaffectivity was related to the other, model. This is the interaffectivity model. The other is not interaffective. It's just embodied affectivity. I know it was very much input here. There's a model of embodied affectivity, and then there's a model of embodied interaffectivity. Both are related, but not the same.
Many thanks for this engaging lecture about embodied interaffectivity, especially this sort of slide. I would like to come back to that slide and ask what kind of...
This one?
This one, and
yeah.
there's another one that is connected to that.
Yeah.
The model slide that you showed. A question that rang through the entire lecture for me was, what role does culture play?
Okay.
How does cultural context figure into that situation of embodied interaffectivity?
Yeah, that's a different, well, not a different, but another huge story which I have left out. Thank you for the question. I can only answer shortly that all our embodied habits, all our implicit relational styles and attitudes and ways of knowing each other are from the start culturally shaped. There are certain ways of behaving, of interacting, which are induced by our cultural habits, by our socialization. Recently I came across a video of a mother-child interaction, the mother interacting with a Japanese boy after 4 months of age, and you saw that the Japanese boy, the young infant, already made these repeated bowing movements with his head that we know so well from Japanese interaction. That's already implied and somehow ingrained in the child's body from very early on. So all our interactions, all our bodily habits are culturally shaped, of course. Yeah. But that would be a huge story, obviously.
Yeah. I guess now we have to close here.
Okay, it's better. It's fine. Thank you very much.